Today, Careblazer, we're talking about the brain. When your loved one first received their diagnosis of dementia, I'm guessing the doctor probably spent some time describing what kind of dementia they think it is and where it may have come from, and even a little bit about the specific parts of the brain that are impacted in their dementia. But if you are like the majority of caregivers, when a family member is getting the diagnosis of dementia, it's hard to really process all that information. So you might not remember everything. It's totally normal. So I want to take this video today to talk about some of the basics about the brain and how different parts of the brain are impacted in dementia. Careblazer, as you may remember from my previous videos on dementia basics, dementia is not actually the specific diagnosis. It's a word, it's a category that's used to describe a bunch of different symptoms somebody might have when they're having trouble with their thinking to the point that it impacts their daily functioning. So things like trouble with memory, attention, processing speed, executive functioning, all of these are possible symptoms in dementia that will significantly impact somebody's daily functioning. I'll link to one of those basic videos below in case you're new here and you're still wondering what the difference is between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But that being said, there's a lot of different reasons somebody might have problems with their thinking. And all of those reasons, regardless of what's causing it, has to do with how well the brain is working. So in order to understand what is actually happening in the brain of somebody with dementia, we have to first learn a little bit about how the brain works. Because the brain is so complex, and depending on the type of dementia the person has, their symptoms can vary from person to person. This is why we see people with the same diagnosis have different types of symptoms. So we're going to break this down in small steps today. So first of all, let's just start with the brain. It's broken down into two hemispheres, the right and the left. Each hemisphere has 4 lobes. 4. We've got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. Try saying that 3 times fast. So each of those lobes has specific functions, and all of them talk to one another.
Careblazer, I'm hopping in because tomorrow, Monday, March 7th, my Make Caregiving Easier 5-day experience kicks off. If you feel like most dementia tips are not working for you, your situation is super challenging, and you feel like the only thing that's going to help you feel better is for your caregiving journey to come to an end, or for your loved one with dementia to change, or for other people to start helping more, I'm here to tell you there are other options. You have so much more power and control over this situation, but nobody has really taken the time to show you. It's a 5-day experience. We get kicked off tomorrow. There's a link below this video, or you can just go to makecaregivingeasier.com. I'm so excited to see you there. Bye.
They communicate. The lobes communicate with one another. So let's talk about the different lobes in the brain and how they are impacted when it comes to dementia. Let's start with the frontal lobe. You guessed it. It's in the front part of the brain. More specifically, it's located behind your forehead, and it is the largest lobe of the brain. The frontal lobes are involved in planning, organizing, decision-making, thinking ahead, but they're also involved in memory, attention, controlling behavior, managing emotions, and also language. So you can see why the frontal lobes are so important. So how does this information relate to dementia? No matter what type of dementia your loved one has, as dementia progresses and gets worse, it starts to impact all areas of the brain. So just because somebody is diagnosed with a dementia that didn't start in their frontal lobes doesn't mean that it's not going to start impacting their frontal lobes. So when somebody has dementia and it's starting to impact the frontal lobes of the brain, this is where we start to see impulsive behaviors, really poor judgment or decision-making, inappropriate or socially inappropriate behaviors, like maybe they don't seem to have a filter anymore and they say things that normally people wouldn't say out loud. They might do some like sexual behaviors, like hypersexual behaviors. They might have a hard time like planning an activity. The frontal lobes are also involved in initiation, like starting an activity. They might not actually know like how to begin a task. And we see a lot just challenging difficulty controlling various emotions and behaviors. A lot of times when we're talking about those difficult dementia behaviors, we're really talking about behaviors that are impacted by the frontal lobe of the brain. There are some types of dementia that start in the frontal lobes, like frontotemporal dementia, and that's where we start to see prominently, like some of the first signs of their dementia tend to be some of these more behavioral emotional symptoms. But somebody with another type of dementia, let's say Alzheimer's disease, can start to show these symptoms as the disease impacts their frontal lobes. A lot of times in frontotemporal dementia, one of the very first signs is a significant change in their personality or behavior. The next lobe I want to talk about is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe, and its job is really to process a lot of sensory information. So this is where the brain is just making sense of all the information coming in. The parietal lobes contain something called the primary sensory cortex, and that basically controls all of our sensation of touch. This is also an area of the brain that is responsible for telling us when something is too hot or too cold or painful. It helps us be able to walk around and navigate the world without constantly bumping into things, and for us to know the difference between which way is up and which way is down. When this part of the brain is impacted, we might see people have a hard time identifying parts of their body. In some cases, they might not even recognize parts of their body. When this area of the brain is impacted, we start to see difficulties like they might just appear to be clumsy, might be bumping into things. They might have a hard time like being able to put on their clothes, know the difference between like right and left, be able to read and write. So next up, we have the temporal lobes. So the temporal lobes are located behind the frontal lobes, but below the parietal lobes. So in this little brain model, you can actually kind of see this like fissure right there. And like, boop, that would be the temporal lobe right there. This is the part of brain that is primarily responsible for memory. It's because we have something called the hippocampus in our temporal lobes that is responsible for learning new information and retaining, hanging on to information. Although the temporal lobe is known for its involvement in memory, it's also involved in speech, being able to produce sounds, understand sounds. So when it comes to dementia, how it would appear if there was impact to the temporal lobes might be that your loved one has significant memory problems. Have you ever noticed that maybe your loved one's memories from long time ago seem to be okay, especially if they're attached to some sort of emotion, versus newer memories, they seem to forget really quickly? Well, part of the reason for that is because when there are long-term memories that have been stored for a while, and especially if they've been around, they're attached to some sort of emotional meaning, those memories are kind of stored throughout the brain, right? Versus newer memories that haven't been around that long and don't have that emotional tie, those are purely staying within the temporal lobe. So it's much easier to forget if there's something wrong with the temporal lobes. The memory is going to be more damaged versus memory that's kind of spread throughout the brain, stored in other areas of the brain besides the temporal lobe. They're more well preserved. The temporal lobe is also involved in creating new memories, like, you know, who you talked to yesterday, what you did yesterday, like the things that are happening now. The temporal lobe is what's going to help somebody remember that. So it makes sense that when the temporal lobe is not working properly, the person's going to have a hard time remembering things that have happened recently. Like I mentioned, the temporal lobe is also important for speech and language. So besides having memory problems, the way this would appear in dementia as well is your loved one might have problems finding words. They might have problems saying words, coming up with the right word. They might have a problem understanding words. So like you're trying to tell them something and it seems like they're not registering at all. And then the last lobe of the brain is the occipital lobe. For some reason, that is the hardest lobe for me to pronounce. It's in the back of the brain. And ironically, it is responsible for vision, yet it's the furthest lobe away from your eyeballs. In dementia, this could impact somebody in their ability to understand shapes, process colors, even be able to differentiate the sizes of different things. All right, Careblazer, the brain is very complicated, right? This was definitely not intended to be an in-depth video on all things the brain. I am not that expert, but it was meant to be an introduction to the different lobes of the brain, what they're primarily responsible for, and how that would impact somebody who has dementia. In a lot of my videos, you've heard me talk about how the person with dementia is not intentionally trying to do a bunch of things that don't make sense or to give you a hard time. A lot of times what's happening is that there's like their brain is not functioning properly. The lobes, there's something happening that is causing them to have that behavior and to have that challenge and difficulty. My hope is that by understanding a bit more about the brain, you'll be able to gain a little bit more understanding about how this disease sometimes leads to those really confusing behaviors you sometimes see in your loved one. All right, Careblazer, what did you learn new in this video? Was there something surprising that you didn't realize? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more videos on the brain and how it works. All right, I'll be back next week. Bye. I broke my brain. What you doing, Nico? Can you help me? We'll just paste it together. All right. That's for my thumbnail.